It often seems like intelligent people lack social skills, where socially highly competent persons are usually not all that smart. No, that isn't how it is. There are exceptions, and much is made of them. And I suppose the popularity of the show, The Big Bang Theory, is an indication of that. So intelligence gets caricatured as the systematizing tendency versus the empathizing tendency. You can look that up if you want this. The systemizing tendency, which is seen in its extreme in the case of autism, is part of the tendency to think systematically and to prefer things to people. And there are intelligent people who are systematizers. They're usually caricaturized as nerds. And the most accurate caricaturization, the most accurate caricature is perhaps the Big Bang, or the most, what would you say, the most amusing caricature, the most thoughtful caricature. But its popularity indicates that, the trope has some merit, some identifiable merit. There are a subset of highly intelligent people who are systematizers, and they tend to lack social skills. But even systematizers who aren't intelligent lack social skills, and you can be virtually certain that the more intelligent systematizers have more social skills than the less intelligent systematizers. So overall, there's a positive relationship between intelligence and social skill. Make no mistake about it, because intelligence, that's general cognitive ability, is such a pervasive phenomena that virtually everything that has a cognitive element, well, I would say everything that has a cognitive element, is positively correlated with IQ, or with general cognitive ability. IQ is general cognitive ability, standardized and corrected for age, by the way. And general cognitive ability is the proclivity for people who do well on solving one set of abstract problems to solve all sets of abstract problems. It's a unitary phenomenon, a very powerful unitary phenomenon. So it's just not the case, and it's certainly not the case that emotional intelligence, which doesn't exist, by the way, it's a manifestation of agreeableness on the Big Five scale, because the Big Five does exist, even though its constituent elements don't have the same predictive power as general cognitive ability. They're reliably measurable and valid predictors of many non-obvious phenomenon, let's say. So the Big Five, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, were derived through statistical techniques that are very similar to those that were used to derive the single factor of general cognitive ability, sometimes parsed into verbal and nonverbal intelligence. And there's some utility in that, even though those two are very highly correlated, especially across time. Factor analysis, which is the statistical technique applied to personality adjectives, reliably reveals that there are 5 factors. And if you're talking about personality, you're talking about one or more of those 5 factors, whether you know it or not, and whether you want to or not, and that's that. Now, you could argue that there are 6 factors. The people who push the Hexaco model do argue that, and more power to them. They seem to have identified something useful in honesty, humility, perhaps. Maybe that's the inverse of what the investigators into the dark triad, which includes Machiavellianism, have also identified. There does seem to be a paucity of words representing malevolence in the Big Five, and that's because those judgmental words were parsed out of many of the adjective lists that were used to derive the Big Five to begin with. There was an attempt to include non-judgmental adjectives in the initial derivation. So maybe there's 6 factors, but there's certainly 5, and perhaps those can be broken down into 10. We broke them down into 10. Colin DeYoung and I and some other compatriots, colleagues and students of mine broke the Big Five down into 10 aspects. If you're interested in that, you can use my personality test at understandmyself.com, which also, by the way, enables you to generate a couples report. So if you and your partner both do the personality test, you can get a couples report that will identify where you are simpatico, let's say, and where you're likely to have trouble and why. So, hypothetically, that's going to be useful. And it's, it is really useful to know that some of the conflicts that you're going to have with your partner are a consequence of the differences between your innate temperaments, and to know that those temperamental differences exist and to be able to take them into account. So anyways, it isn't the case that highly intelligent people lack social skills. It is the case that we're very motivated to look at the deficits of highly intelligent people because it's so annoying that they exist. Look, when I taught at Harvard, I used to have some of the undergraduates over for lunch or dinner, not nearly as often as I would have liked to or should have. My experience with the Harvard undergraduates was that, and they're very highly selected on the basis of general cognitive ability, by the way, although that's not the only means of selection, even though it perhaps should be, because that would be more fair than what's being done currently. That isn't to say that that would be optimal, because conscientiousness might be taken into account validly, and so might openness, which is the creativity dimension. If you're going to consider personality, conscientiousness would be at the top of the list. Anyhow, my observation with the Harvard undergraduates was 1/3 of them were as smart as anybody you're ever going to meet. And those were kids who you could teach something to and they would immediately grip it, and then they would immediately generalize it to areas that perhaps you haven't even considered, which is a hallmark of extreme intelligence and also to some degree of creativity. So that was always very interesting. 1/3 of them would catch on faster than virtually everybody you ever met, but didn't have that generalization capacity. And then 1/3 would get it if they worked. And so that was the Harvard undergraduate population. And so I would invite students, particularly from that upper third, let's say, to have lunch, because they were very interesting to me, those kids, and get to know them. And they were almost without exception, and perhaps without exception, they were great people. They were generally attractive. They were socially skilled. They were humble, and going to an Ivy League school like Harvard, at least at that time, was a humbling experience, because no matter how smart you were, where you came from, and you were very likely to be a valedictorian, for example, if you were admitted to Harvard, you were not as smart as some of the people around you, and you were way not as smart as some of them. And so it was a humbling experience for everyone. Now, they might have been puffed up because they were at Harvard to some degree, but within Harvard, that was a whole different story. That's not a place that's all that easy on your ego as a first year. So, and that's something to think about if you barely got in. I would recommend, if you barely got in, that you attend somewhere where you're a bigger fish in a smaller pond. It'd be a lot easier on you psychologically. Maybe the connection network wouldn't be as good, but I would generally recommend that, you don't go somewhere where you barely made it. I don't think that's the best possible route. Anyways, these kids in the upper third of the upper, 1/10 of 1 percentile, by no means lacked social skills. Most of them were good athletes, because that was also a criteria for admission, or they had performed some other quite remarkable feat of accomplishment, at least one, by the time they were applying, because to get into Harvard, you needed to have extremely high general cognitive ability. Let's say you probably also needed to be conscientious, at least implicitly, but you definitely needed to have accomplished one or two remarkable things in your life before you got selected, because general cognitive ability wasn't enough, because Harvard had a plethora of candidates in the stratosphere echelons of general cognitive ability. And so, I used to joke with my wife after we had a dinner like this that, we're both primed to want to hate this highly accomplished person who had done so much by the time they were 18. But, on meeting them, you could see exactly why they got to where they were. And that was merit, insofar as that was properly selected for by the selection committee, which at that time was less corrupt than it is now, although not without its corruptions. So, no, wrong. intelligent people don't lack social skills. A subset of highly intelligent people who are systematizers in their thinking lack social skills. And it's convenient for all the rest of us, insofar as we aren't in those upper echelons of general cognitive ability, to look for the weaknesses of those who are, but I'm afraid the story isn't that comforting. So EQ is not inversely proportional to IQ. Quite the contrary. So, look, think about it. The more complicated the cognitive activity, the better at it people who have high general cognitive ability are. Now, there isn't anything more complicated than reading other people. So why would IQ falter in its prediction of that capability? And then let's think about this a little bit further with regards to convenience. So let's say you're a lawyer or a clinical psychologist or a doctor for that matter. And let's say that you've been selected for that occupation. Well, what's been used to select you? Well, in the case of clinical psychologist, which is probably the most relevant case, although lawyers and doctors also deal with people all the time and need to have a certain degree of emotional intelligence, which, by the way, doesn't exist. It's agreeableness fundamentally in the big five pantheon. I think I forgot to finish that thought earlier. In any case, clinical psychologists are selected in large part, although not entirely, well, on the basis of their GRE scores. That's the test used to get into, to screen applicants across universities when they apply to postgraduate clinical psychology programs, which are very, very, very hard to get into. So, which means that the applicant to admission ratio is extremely high. It's at least as hard to get into as medical school, and I would argue probably harder, but I might be wrong because they're both very hard to get into. You're basically selected on the basis of your GRE scores. About a third of your application would be of your success would be a consequence of your GRE scores and your grades. And both of those are central markers for general cognitive ability. And so all the people who practice clinical psychology have been selected on the basis of general cognitive ability. And maybe that's not the only criteria that should have been used. And it isn't, because, evaluation committees look at things like letters of recommendation, which are not particularly valid predictors of competence, by the way, but maybe can be used to screen out, by reading between the lines. Generally, the letters of recommendation for anybody applying to programs that are highly selective are glowing. And so it's very difficult to differentiate between them. And a predictor with no differentiation has no utility. And increasingly, people are loath to provide accurate letters of recommendation because they're afraid that, well, they'll be caught up in some scandal if they let their opinion be known. So they're in all likelihood becoming less valid predictors. But in any case, I'm hammering this point home because it needs to be hammered home. Intelligent people are better at everything that's complicated. It's the nature of intelligence. It's the central nature of intelligence. And, there are vast differences in intelligence between people, and those have massive real world consequences. And doesn't that just suck? Well, it certainly does. It's perhaps the most inedible object that psychological research has, generated for your delectation. And it isn't even clear that our culture can absorb the knowledge without crumbling. So, but there it is, and we're forced to deal with it. Now, the upside is, because we can measure general cognitive ability, and this, you got to think this through, people, everyone, we can sort people on general cognitive ability. And so that's a bloody catastrophe for those who don't make the sorting, isn't it? And something has to be done about that, and some thought put into it. Some real thought put into it. Not hand-waving that says everyone can be trained to do anything, which is liberal bullshit. It's a lie. It's not true. It's an anti-truth. Unfortunately, because wouldn't it be lovely if that was the case? And hard work, which is expressed in trait conscientiousness, can compensate to some degree. But no matter how hard I work, for example, I'm never going to be the kind of mathematician that can do cosmological level or particle level physics. I've seen mathematical geniuses. I've had some of them as students. They could learn in a month what took me 5 years not to learn very well. I had a student who was a systematizer on the autistic spectrum, and although also highly verbally proficient in her systematic way, God, she learned more about statistics in 2 months being my graduate student than I did in 12 years of being a PhD candidate and then a researcher. And you know, she won awards for teaching statistics in her first semester. And those concepts to her were like reading an ABC book for me. And I'm not like that. You know, I have some sense of my own intellectual limitations. I certainly see them in the mathematical realm. My verbal intelligence is very high, but my nonverbal intelligence it's high, but it's not very high. And I've met people who have very high nonverbal intelligence and had the privilege to work with them. But, you know, the thing about the sorting is that obviously it's extremely hard on people who don't make the cut in whatever direction the cut is being made. But it allows the rest of us morons to be in a position to take preferential advantage of the talent that we've winnowed and that is now being presented to us. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's in our best interest, people? Are we going to swallow the bitter pill of differences in general cognitive ability so that we can exploit for our own utility the massive advantage that those who have high general cognitive ability are able to present to us? And are we going to play the game straight so that we do open the door to those who have proficiency in that regard so they can maximize their talent and therefore benefit the rest of us? Because that's what we do when we use objective merit-based screening for application to places like Harvard. And if we did that, well, we'd stop screening out the Asians, for example, which is an unbelievably perverse thing to do, given that they have an edge in conscientiousness, probably for cultural reasons. But it's certainly the case that at Ivy League institutes, very, very many Asians in particular, who have exceptional general cognitive ability, are being screened out of the competition for personality defects. And it's appalling. And, you know, if the liberals who are listening to this, and there's probably not that many of them, but for the liberals who are listening to this, is that really the kind of diversity that you're promoting? Is that what you want? You're going to hobble the ability of the entire culture to take advantage of the pool of human intelligence that our testing technology allows us to identify? Now, you know, those people who are screened out and go to less prestigious institutions than Harvard are likely to do pretty damn well there as well. So, you know, there are people who are going to land on their feet, but that's not the point. The point is, our most prestigious institutes should be most open to those who are most capable of most benefiting. And it's clearly those who would be selected with objective analysis. And for those of you who object to the idea of objective analysis, you just try and replace it with something better. You know, extremely highly trained and extraordinarily intelligent psychometric experts have been trying to do that for 100 years, supported by the best research institutions in the world, and they have come up with general cognitive ability and conscientiousness, and that's a really hard game to beat. I tried developing a neuropsychological battery as an adjunct to general cognitive ability, for example, and did actually manage to differentiate the personality screeners in some useful manner by breaking them into the 10 aspects that are tested, again, in understandmyself.com. And we found some incremental predictive utility in that differentiation. That took 15 years of research effort, which involved, by the way, some of those people who were selected for extraordinarily high general cognitive ability on the basis of the tests that I was trying to compete with. My competition wasn't successful, except insofar as I was able to differentiate, with my colleagues, able to differentiate personality, into 10 aspects. So that meant we broke conscientious down conscientiousness down into industriousness and orderliness. And industriousness seems to be a better predictor of performance in social institutions than does orderliness. There's some domain-specific prediction that still remains for orderliness, but but that was a small incremental utility improvement. You're not going to replace general cognitive ability with anything that's better. And hey, man, knock yourself out trying. I did for 15 years. I built a commercially applicable product as well, which I couldn't sell because it was too accurate